I do thank you for giving me just a minute of your time. David Tulis, brought to you by Nooganomics.com, the website for the man who matters. It's not popular, and it's not popular because in the end there are very few people who matter. But I'm trying to change that. I'm trying to make more and more people matter. But I know you matter because you're here tuning into the David Tulis program, and I do thank you for the 2 or 3 minutes that you're giving to me today. We're talking with Chris Sorensen. We're live, of course, on AM Radio 1240 and FM 92.7, and also 95.3 HD4. That's a high definition FM channel with a 60-mile range. Glad that you are tuning in to us, even though you may be in the heart of Georgia. Now, we've been asking the question about the effect of the gospel, and my argument for progress, that Christianity does have a tremendous argument for progress that I can give you in 6 words, and that is the transition from wrath to grace, and that is the whole human story from Adam and Eve to the last day when Christ will return, and we'll find that the work of the gospel is largely accomplished by the weakest of all means. That would be what Chris Sorensen and his ministers do every Lord's Day, and that's preaching the gospel. By faithful preaching the gospel, societies are transformed. That alone, and of course the word now written and widely published, that those 2 things bring cultural, economic, political, legal, and every other kind of transformation and reform. And we're looking now at a question before the City Council. The City Council tomorrow will be weighing in on a proposal by Council Member Chip Henderson. Everybody seems to be favorable to what he has to say, or not disfavorable enough to vote against it, and that is a ban on the private use of homes, the ban on the use of private homes by those who are part of Airbnb, the short-term vacation rental network, online, part of the sharing economy. There are many platforms that do that service, and so I use Airbnb just as a shorthand for the whole industry. It is a growing economy. It is a prosperous development favoring Chattanooga, which loves, as we're supposed to believe, loves having visitors. Chris, is there something bleak and small, narrow-minded about this proposal? Where do you see either bigotry or isolationism in the Chip Henderson ban on large parts of the Airbnb market in Chattanooga?
Sure. I mean, so I want to admit that I may not know all of the complexities of the issue. And what I will say is it does seem like some of this may be built on fear. And maybe fear from the hotel industry, or maybe some lobbying from the hotel industry. I don't know. I do know that the Westin's building a brand new hotel, so the hotel industry seems to be okay. But I think maybe it's some fear from people. Things are changing. Things are changing in Chattanooga. And yet, I mean, I think the gospel has a lot to say about the stranger, that we're supposed to welcome in the stranger. And this is a way for us to do that. And I love the idea that people can come stay in a home and really get a feel for the neighborhoods before they move here. And I also want to say, I hope they move here. I mean, I've lived in a bunch of different places. I lived in the New York City area for a decade. And I can tell you that I find Chattanooga in many ways to be much more progressive than New York City, in the sense of trying so hard to build a good economy. I see a lot of good people coming together to build a lot of, and the EPB thing, the fiber optics obviously was a game changer in Chattanooga. It happened right as we were moving here, and it's been a game changer. But at the same time, I think there's also a different group of people in Chattanooga, whether they be people who just long for old Chattanooga. I don't know what old Chattanooga looked like, but I think it had more of a small town feel. I think there are people who are retiring to Chattanooga. And what I would say is Chattanooga is increasingly becoming a city. It's no longer a town. We experienced this at the old Camp House location, which was in the south side. A lot of our neighbors were upset with all the activity that the Camp House generated in that neighborhood. You would think they'd be excited about all this activity in their neighborhood, but they actually weren't excited. They thought it was loud. They thought it was annoying that there was cars on the street. And yet I kind of want to say, but this is what cities are. This is what cities are. And so I understand the idea that somebody could come and stay. I mean, God forbid, somebody comes and stays in an Airbnb home and is is somehow a terrible person and does something terrible to somebody in the neighborhood. I think that that can happen whether somebody's staying in an Airbnb home or not. It can also obviously happens every day in our news that somebody actually living in homes and neighborhoods does something terrible. But I don't think there's a higher percentage or higher likelihood of crime because somebody's staying in an Airbnb home. And so that's my, and then there's the other economic side of this, which is, this is providing economic means to some people. It's a whole new stream of income. And when we talk about property, obviously in the Bible, there's this idea of private property being upheld. At the same time, there's this idea of the year of Jubilee. I was thinking about that, the year of Jubilee being that, every 49, 50 years, all the debts are forgiven, even land reverts back to its original ownership and things like that. By the way, if we really practice the year of Jubilee, all of the Native Americans would get all of their land back. But I think there's a greater principle at place that God is getting at, which is that when wealth is accumulated at the top tier of the wealthiest people in a very small group of people, it actually has bad economic impact on the society at large. And so this year of Jubilee was just a way, it was sort of a mandate by God by which like everybody has an opportunity again. And in the last 30 to 50 years in the United States, we see the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world going to the top 1% of America. And I don't have any policy suggestions about that, but I will say that it just makes sense that that's bad for our economy. Not only does it not give everybody an opportunity to flourish at the same level, but also, when you have so much wealth accumulated in such a small population, what you end up with is less consumers. You have a smaller group of people that can spend money, which will slow down the economy. So I just thought about this land ownership, and I thought about Jubilee, and then that led me down this stream of going, boy, God had a way of sort of re-leveling the playing field so that not just so that like the little man has an opportunity, but for the overall health of a economic system, you need more consumers. And so if you have more wealth in a smaller group of people, then the economy is going to slow down because they can't spend all that they have.
Well, our analysis is, Chris Sorensen, that's by design, that this shifting of wealth to the upper 0.5% is not an accident. The system is designed that way, and it is destined for collapse. The Midwest Policy Director of Airbnb, Laura Spangian, makes note a day or so ago, well, actually today, in Chattanooga.com, that most hosts in Chattanooga are female, of short-term vacation rentals in that network are female, and a quarter of the hosts are over the age 50, often empty nesters, she says, who are sharing an extra room in their house. A typical host only shares his or her home 45 nights per year, and the hosts typically earn about $5,300, helping pay things like mortgage, student loan, or saving for retirement. So there's the human interest in that. Now, Chris, you're the abbot of Mission Chattanooga, a Christian organization with its roots in Africa, where African Christians saw how impoverished American Christians were becoming and how little effect Christianity was having on Christians in North America, including in Tennessee. And so you helped them start a mission here. Mm-hmm. You believe that that in Christianity there's a theory of social progress. How does Christianity work in this whole question about the city council trying to impose a ban on a marketplace activity? Is there a Christian argument one can make for the free use of home, or is it a right use of the magistrate's authority to stamp out an activity under the rubric of public health, safety, and welfare?
That's a lot to think through. I don't know all of the complexity, so I don't want to speak for the people who are bringing about the policy, this sort of suggestion. I don't want to speak for them. I do believe there's this underlying fear, and fear is not of God. I mean, fear is never of God. He doesn't make us, it's not of God. But I also believe, that people need the best chance they can to create as many businesses as possible. And so I think it makes sense to me, although admittedly somewhat ignorant, I'm not a policymaker, but at the same time, it makes sense to me that we would want this Airbnb thing to thrive. You know, I just stayed in Airbnb for a week in Montana and I loved it. I just, yeah. So
you say you're not a policymaker, but you do, as an ordained minister, you do represent God's interests among humankind. And so you would say that the right of owning property comes from God. That is it's
Deuteronomy. I mean, that's very clear.
And the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal, implies the right of ownership. And sometimes, of course, ownership has to be yielded. And in our country, we have eminent domain, and where there's a clear public interest, say the building of a highway, that would require the sale in order to sell land for a public interest, and that I think that's defensible before God. But many other things are not.
I mean, I think that goes into Jubilees. So there are times where I think private ownership, private property, for the sake of the whole, there are times that we have to look at regulation and things like that. But yeah, well, but in this case, to preemptively believe that by renting a home it's going to cause more crime, I'd have to see a lot of statistics, but it's almost like a preemptive strike. If something terrible happens, then you can bring a lawsuit. You can, I mean, and the Bible actually has judges, right? So you can bring a lawsuit if something terrible happens. Somebody, rents out their Airbnb, and then whoever they rent it to destroys your property next door. Well, then sue them, and then that sort of will take care of itself.
And so if there is a wrong, that's the courts are open. The courts are open to redress a wrong. If you, my listener, have been injured by someone, you can take that person to court and have the jury find the facts and make the award of your compensation to make things right again, to make you whole. But regulation says, well, we're going to pretend that courts don't exist, and we have to control everything up front by all these rules. Everyone has to get permission. Some people are simply banned from a particular activity, and those whom we license here by our authority, by our permission, they can do this thing, but they have to follow all of our rules, which again, that presumes that courts don't exist, and that we have to have the state or the city own the activity, which is what you do when you license something. Is you own it, and you then let people enter into the activity by your leave and permission if they pay.
Right, and I at the Mission Chattanooga, at our Sunday services, I would guess that somewhere between 10 to 20% of our parishioners actually participate in Airbnb. That's a large percentage, but that's because we own the camp house. Camp house draws a lot of entrepreneurs in there throughout the week. They have coffee, they have meetings. Eventually, they end up attending on Sundays. And so we have a lot of entrepreneurial people, but it's a major source of income for our people. And this may be why I'm a little bit passionate about it. It would really hurt some of our people if there were more regulations in place.
This is David Tulis. Thanks for joining us. We're talking with Chris Sorensen, who's the abbot at Mission Chattanooga, the camp house. Now, in the campaign for mayor, Chris, there was some discussion about the homeless. This, in my analysis at Nooganomics.com, and here is that this was mostly just a talk for show. Because the question of affordable housing does not touch the poor. The poor can't afford a rent at all. And so to say, well, we're going to have a more affordable housing, as the mayor did, or as Larry Grome proposed, really doesn't deal with those who have no home at all. They're not touched by this discussion. Now, in the campaign, I proposed what I call the Shantytown Project, and the rubric was, your shantytown is my free trade zone in housing. And there I proposed that there be places set aside by the city, blocked off in small squares, where people could come, homeless people could come build whatever structure they wanted to. And if they stayed in that structure for 2 years or more and could prove it by administrative means, they could own that piece of land. That would give them a capital asset. They would have a fixed address. They would start having neighbors. They would have the other fellow homeowners, fellow neighbors, also homeless. Again, the lowest strata of the economy. They would be able to secure their goods, which is another major problem among the poor who are homeless. They can't secure their goods. They always have to carry everything with them all the time, so they can't accumulate anything. And so personal safety, another question for females, the weak among the men. They're often vulnerable, and so if they can have their own homes and have security, and then be able to take ownership, they have a capital asset. But they're committing to Chattanooga. See, what we're doing is we're wanting to effectively draw people who want to commit to staying here. That's what would happen in this shantytown concept that I discussed with the candidates, except for the mayor. The mayor wouldn't talk to me. What do you make? What do you make of this kind of idea? Which again,
it's funny you call it shantytown. The funny thing is, we have a number of our clergy went to Regent in Vancouver. It's a great seminary, and in Vancouver, there's a big tiny house movement because, of course, property values are so high there. So you have these tiny houses that can fit in the space of a parking space, right? And they came home so excited. We need tiny houses, and I said, well, the problem with tiny houses in Chattanooga is land is cheap here. So, land in general is cheap.
That's a problem?
Well, no, it's good, but you might not need a tiny house. Why would you have a tiny house, when you can get a regular house, and the tiny houses cost like $30,000 a lot of times. So the funniest part, though, is as we started speaking about it, they're like, but what if we put a bunch of tiny houses on one lot? And I said, okay. And then they're like, we can have a community room. And I said, okay. And then I laughed and said, we could call it Hobo Village. And they laughed too, but there is something to that. And when I was in Seattle, this is they have some new transitional housing that are these tiny houses in one lot. They have 8 houses, and there's very strict sort of rules that govern, these are planned communities, so to speak. But it's working in Seattle. Exactly what you're describing is actually working in Seattle.
Well, my proposal has the advantage of not having any capital or any expense on the part of anybody, because a tiny house is at least $2,000.
Right.
So someone has to pay for that. Then it has to be built, and the person who occupies it doesn't have a stake in it because he didn't build it. Now, in my plan, if you build your own shack with cast-off lumber and cast-off nails and blue tarpaulin and the like, again, it looks shabby. But you have a stake in it. You've built it, or you've built it with the help of others, your neighbors. Again, it's a minimal capital investment, and it doesn't require anybody to commit large amounts of money. That I think would esteem the poor. But the problem is, why do people not like an idea like this, Chris Sorensen? Why is this idea objectionable to many people, maybe even the listener?
They're afraid of their own property values. They're afraid of there's a presumption that somebody who's homeless is dangerous. Well, we have one of our church members is homeless. He's one of our most faithful attenders, and he's a wonderful man. His name is Randy, but he has some, psychological stuff going on, and it's not enabled him to have a job, but he's totally harmless. I think some of these things there's a presumption that these things can't be vetted, but I think they can be vetted like fairly easily. I mean, Jimmy Turner, who's part of our church, he runs the community kitchen. He can tell you who we can start this with no-brainer people, people who are just good people who lack homes. And by the way, I can tell you that if we got a lot, the Mission of Chattanooga got a lot, and we were allowed to do something like this, I think we would be all in. It's a great idea. So,
well, I think the reason I like this idea, Chris Sorensen, is that the opponents of it have a low view of poor people. They view low people as somewhat like trash. I think the argument that I raised in the campaign, as far as I could, was that the shantytown idea esteems the poor people, respects the poor people, and says, look, you can make something of yourself. And the more time they spend in a particular location, the more stable they'll be, the more they'll have to have a relationship with neighbors, the more they'll have to look out for each other. There are all kinds of things that the homeless drifting life encourages in the way of self-seeking. If you're in a place and you have a commitment to stay there, and you're trying to stay there for 2 years to be able to get ownership of that lot, which could be worth $400 or $500, you are going to be much more thinking of others. You'll be much more other-centric, and I think that's really a better view to have of poor people. It's not condescending, but most people can't view them that way. They just can't.
Agreed. I mean, I think that it's funny. For too long, I want to be careful how I say this. This can get me in trouble, David.
Go ahead.
For too long, the Christian, quote unquote, Christian voice in America, which is a very select group of people, with a very particular point of view. But the Christian view, quote unquote, in America has been a very, let me try to say it a different way. I think that it's time for Christians to fight for the dignity of people who are living as much as they are fighting for the dignity of those who are not born, is a way to say it. So you find Christians protesting for, against abortion, for instance, and yet they're not protesting for the inherent dignity of people who are living right in our city.
Well, the ones who but the problem there, Chris, is the ones who are living are not threatened with extinction at the hand of the vacuum cleaner and the dilation and curettage, whereas the unborn are. So there is something different there. Chris Sorensen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How can my listener get a hold of you?
They can go to Chris at missionchattanooga.org, and you can come out to the camp house. I'm there most days drinking coffee. Go to missionchattanooga.org to learn more about our organization, thecamphouse.com to learn about the camp house. We look forward to meeting you.
And this is David Tulis. Thanks for giving us a few minutes of your time. We're here. Check out Nooganomics.com, and do appreciate your time. Now, support me by supporting all of our advertisers here at Nooga Radio. David Tulis.
Nooga Radio, AM 1240, 92.7 FM.
Are you looking for a gospel-oriented, covenantal, family